Okay, here goes the part where I have to risk my brand, okay, as the infamous astrologist. And that's in letting you all know that the moon and Venus, these are two different aspects of divine feminine or the female archetype. The transit sense South Node Libra is about undoing the catalytic lessons, the catalytic karmic lessons of feminism. The moon is where the image of the woman has to ascend back to upon matriarchal wisdom. Venus is the adolescence, the arrested developmental state of the one who is manufactured, engineered to be in that loss, detached and alienated from matriarchal source wisdom, which is the only pathway to womanhood, okay? Realized as a consequence, result, or gift of the number 9 Hermit card, South Node, okay? Virgo, which is what we have right now. Mars is there, enhancing and sharpening that realization. Events that have been taking place since Donald Trump hit office has accelerated this realization. It has intensified this realization. Many of you out there, I know, okay, and I get it also, you feel triggered when somebody says something about feminism. You feel triggered when somebody says something about, oh, this has a lot to do with the change of women, okay? You start crying, you start running off, you start folding your arms. I get it, okay? But I'm here to be honest, not to be popular. I'm here to keep it real and not collect fans. It would be nice to be popular. It would be nice to be liked. It would be nice to be understood, appreciated, and valued for what I really do have to offer. But I can't help what every person's personal challenge is with their self. I can't help that. If you can't get over yourself, what in life will you ever get to understand? So it is what it is. This is examination of what happened to females and what has to happen to females to restore the source of civilization, which is the female upon matriarchal wisdom. Civilization declines when she is alienated from her matriarchal source. This is not only for her, but that context applies for every one of us universally. However, the original intent is based on her. Malcolm X once said, a nation rises no higher than its woman. That is the infallible truth. So we are being risen and ascended by her rising and ascension. And many of you may be disappointed that it doesn't look like a bunch of half-dressed, half-naked females in high heels claim to be bad bitches and everything else that you like to see, okay, in media. That's what you want to be the case, but it's not. It couldn't be farther from the truth. So I'm giving an explanation about Venus because Venus is now coming to read from her mother, the moon. She's coming to learn from her mother, the moon. She's coming to absorb from her mother, the moon. And she will convert that wisdom of morality, the moral compass within, that which was taken away by feminism, liberalism, and the Obama's initiation of a dead society, a moral deprived society. This is the restoration. And Venus has to be connected to that matriarchal constitution, that matriarchal source, in order for her ethical reads and relationships to hold accuracy, to hold significance and sincerity, to be effective. She has to get that read. So her mother reads morals and she reads ethics. Understand? So let's look at what the difference of this is as we explore what all that means.
When discussing communication ethics, it's important to understand exactly what is meant by ethics. Sometimes people confuse ethics with behaving in accordance with social conventions, religious beliefs, and the law. And sometimes the term ethics and morals are used interchangeably because they clearly are both related to right and wrong. However, they are not the same thing at all. Ethics refer to rules provided by an external source. They are governed by professional and legal guidelines within a particular time and place. Ethics are all about how we deal with gray areas, and ethics therefore refer to the value judgments we make on bigger and smaller matters, in communication as well as in other fields. A concrete example of ethics are codes of conduct in workplaces. Lawyers, policemen, and doctors all have to follow an ethical code laid down by their profession, regardless of their own feelings or preferences. In a specific communication setting, we can say that the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics is a very good example. In this code, several principles of ethical journalism are included, with instructions on how to behave as an objective, transparent, and reliable journalist. In this code of ethics, we find principles such as seek truth and report it, and minimize harm for sources, subjects, colleagues, and members of the public. Morals refer to an individual's own principles regarding right and wrong. For example, a journalist may exaggerate a little to create a more sensational story. These principles are not written in legal guidelines, but are subject to one's own gut feelings about what is good or bad. And of course, most decisions are not captured in a code of conduct, but ask for people's personal cultural norms for dealing with issues. Then you really must trust your own moral compass. When we study people's principles about what is good or bad, we find two forms of ethics: descriptive and prescriptive ethics. The crucial difference between these principles is describing or explaining behavior versus guiding or prescribing behavior. Descriptive ethics are concerned with what is. They are also known as comparative ethics. This is the scientific study of moral beliefs and practices of different people and cultures in various places and times, in order to describe how people behave and think when dealing with moral issues and arguments. The essential question in this form of ethics is, what do people think is right in a certain place, time, or situation? Prescriptive ethics are all about what ought to be. Therefore, this form is also known as normative ethics. This is the study of...
A comparison has to be made between ethics and morals simply because we have to make the comparison between the moon and Venus. This especially since we have Venus transiting through Cancer currently at the first decan, which manifests 2 of Cups, and Jupiter at the second decan manifesting 3 of Cups. What Venus does when she comes to Cancer is she sources higher standards, or more appropriate, accurate, aligned standards to convert into ethics in her relations. Understand, it is a conversion. Ethics is informed by moral sensitivities. Our morals is a thing of our own business, a thing of our own awareness that guides our own inner compass. The sensitivities of rights, value, respect, reverence, care. It's an acknowledgement of vulnerabilities, weaknesses, sensitivities, justice, especially justice, fairness, equality, all of the above.
The world around us is a smorgasbord of beliefs, claims, rules and norms about how we should live and behave. It's important to tease apart these factors so we can put them in their proper place. Otherwise, it can be hard to know what to do, especially when some of these requirements contradict others. Let's talk about 3 different categories of demands on how we should live: ethics, morality, and law. Laws are formal rules that govern how we behave as members of a society. They specify what we must do, and more frequently, what we must not do. They're upheld and applied by the state and the court system, and their role is to create a basic, enforceable standard of behaviour. But the law has a much narrower focus than either morality or ethics. Laws can be just or unjust and are subject to ethical assessment. Plus, there are some matters about which the law will be silent, but where morality and ethics have a lot to say. For example, the law is of no use if you're trying to decide whether to speak up when you hear a friend make a racist joke. But ideas about what's good and right will still guide our judgment here. Morality refers to an informal framework of values, principles, beliefs, customs, and ways of living. Moralities aren't usually enforced by the state, but there are often social pressures to conform to moral norms. Some people consider themselves to be so strongly bound by certain moral codes that even to question the moral system would be wrong. Some examples of moralities include Christianity, Stoicism, and Buddhism. Each of these provides a set of answers to basic ethical questions like, how should I live and what should I do? Many people inherit their morality from their family, community, or culture. It's rare for someone to shop around for the morality that most closely fits their personal beliefs. Usually, the process of moral formation is unconscious. What sets morality apart from ethics is that you can apply a morality as a matter of habit without having to think. You can simply obey or follow instructions from those who claim moral authority within a particular tradition. And for some people, this is enough. Maybe a world of habitually virtuous individuals is better than one where people are habitually vicious. Plus, having a coherent, consistent account of how to live can be a source of comfort, especially in a complex and uncertain world. But there is also a risk in living what the Greek philosopher Socrates called an unexamined life. If we just accept a ready-made answer to the question of how we should live, we might live our whole lives under a moral system which, if we'd thought about it, we would have rejected in part or in full. This is where ethics comes in. Ethics is a branch of philosophy that aims to answer the basic question, what should I do? It's a process of reflection in which people's decisions are shaped by their values, principles, and purpose rather than unthinking habits or social conventions. Our values, principles, and purpose are what give us a sense of what's good, right, and meaningful in our lives. They serve as a reference point for all the possible courses of action we could choose. On this definition, an ethical decision is one based on conscious reflection and which gives effect to our values, principles, and purpose in pursuit of a proper goal. It can be tempting to see law, morality, and ethics as more or less the same. We might think that so long as we're fulfilling our legal or moral obligations, we can consider ourselves ethical. In reality, there is more to ethics than morality and law. Ethics requires us to think about issues the law can't or doesn't address. It puts moral systems under the microscope to see if they hold up. In an ideal world, our ethical beliefs shape the kinds of laws and moral systems a society develops. When our conscious, reflective, ethical views on what's good and right change, we ought to change the laws to reflect them. And likewise,
Where it originates is the fourth house, the culture of the home, the environment of the home, where it is realized what effects we have upon the environment based on our behaviors, our interactions, and the sensitivities that we have with each other. So, morals are a local code of conduct that is within the self-realization. It's where we find our safety emotionally. We find our safety. It's where we create the security to express ourselves in a vulnerable capacity. This is why morals is an energy of the fourth house. The fourth house is where we expect to be vulnerable. It's where we expect to be unguarded, where we expose our jugular vein, where we reveal our secrets, our sensitivities. So morals has to be there where we're in such a territory that represents the anatomy of the crab, as I described before, the soft inner core, protected by the strong carapace or shell. Okay? So, Venus has a job to do here, because what happens when this code of behavior, sensitivity, and judgment of what is right, judgment of what is wrong, it has to merge with others who are not of your home, who are not of your culture, who are not of your community. How do we compromise and find a standard or common ground by which we can relate and agree upon what is appropriate or not to express consideration, respect, and sensitivity to the differences, the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities of other people who have to share resources, environments, circumstances, or who are engaged in contractual agreement where there are interactions and exchanges. This is where ethics comes in at.
And likewise, our moralities should evolve in response to insights generated from ethical reflection. But we can only do this if we have a toolkit that keeps open questions to do with what is good and right. And that toolkit, that's ethics.
Venus is the one who establishes ethics. She is the ruler of the seventh house. She is also the ruler of the second house. The second house is where we realize values. What is there to respect? What is there to honor? What is important to me or important to others? What should be protected and preserved? What is something that we have a dependence upon, or something that we need to count on? What should be guarded? Where do boundaries need to be at? These things helps us to find where value is at. What is there to reverence in our life? This is how we source and realize where value is at. That is the second house. Taurus, ruled by Venus. Between people is value. What is with every person is value. What gets exchanged between others is value. So that honor, that integrity, and respect has to be there wherever there is value. So likewise, there has to be a reverence and honor, respect, sensitivity, acknowledgement of what someone is worth, of the value that others carry, the importance of different hierarchies. Everyone needs to feel like they can trust the interaction, trust the atmosphere, trust the environment, should we need to be vulnerable? Should we need to step beyond our guard to fulfill duties and responsibilities naturally? Something has to let us know that we're going to be okay, we're going to be safe if we have to make exchanges of value. Because in the course of exchanging value, injuries can happen, misunderstandings, insults, offenses, oppression, injustice. So ethics guides us to preserve justice between each other, to maintain a sense of justice between each other. What is fair, what is right, what is respectable, what is acceptable. Venus is a sensitivity that homes us into that, because it is Venus through the astral body that connects us with the 5 or even 6 senses through Taurus, okay? The brain, the spinal cord, that is Taurus, okay? Starting with it's basically an enlarged sperm cell, understand? The brain and the spinal cord, that is Taurus. So with these 5 senses, or even 6 senses as I mentioned, we gauge and judge where there is harm, injury, offense, pain, discomfort, pleasure, happiness, joy. So the point of ethics is to promote good feeling and to avoid bad feeling, to promote positive engagement and to minimize negative interactions and engagement. That is the essence of ethics, because you're managing what the 5 senses are reading or picking up, which is why ethics moves across the threshold of what we see, what we say, how we do.
Relationship between society and ethics. We're going to start by asking the question, what exactly is society? We can say that society is an ordered community of free persons. We can ask ourselves, is society really important to us? It turns out that as far back as Aristotle, people were considering that the special thing about humans was that they were social animals, social creatures. More recently, sociologists have discovered through field research that humans brought up to maturity without adequate contact with society are stunted in their growth, usually don't have long life expectancies, and often don't behave anything like what we would come to think as humans. They can't walk upright, they can't speak, they tend to eat very, well, for our purposes, rather poorly. The conclusion from sociology is that society forms humans and actually enables them to act in the way that we associate with being human. So society, one way or another, is important to people. The next question is, what does orderly mean? It can really only mean in some way predictable and operating in some trustworthy manner. Society, one way or another, is made up of people, of persons. And that raises the question of what is a person? Are dogs and cats or rose bushes people? There's something about the human person that makes them social, and the organisation of a human society is different to, say, a hive of bees or a pride of lions. Connected with this notion of uniquely human societies and communities is the importance of freedom. We need to look at freedom to see why is it important to society and to ethics. What we can conclude is that ethics are principles for the free, orderly social action that realises the common good. Common good here refers to a rather general concept, which is not the personal good of me or you, it's the good of our community as a whole. You're coming along to be a part of a class. Really, it's a little educational society. And if we all work well together, I give you ideas, you learn them, apply them, whatever, then we end up with a good outcome. You're able to go out into the world educated as a property economist. In more general terms, in larger society, the common good is that manner in which the society realises the happiness, the maximum happiness of its members. Often that means realising or making decisions for the good of the community, which might be personally inconvenient. Driving on the left-hand side of the road may not always suit me, but one way or another, it makes for a more orderly society. It stops all the other people on the road from having to drive off in every direction because of my personal choices in where I drive, that sort of thing. When we look at society, we find that sociologists have observed that there are different types of societies. But it comes down ultimately to two different types of society based on two different understandings of what the human person is. One view of what people are is that they're rational, self-interested individuals. And for those of you who have done economics, you may remember or recall that the economic actor, Homo economicus, is known as a rational, self-interested individual. And if we are no more than rational, in other words, we always follow kind of logic, then we'll always act for our good, really independent of what's happening around us.
Because all of that is detected by the five senses. And wherever there is a detection of the five senses, we're able to read or pick up offenses or not. Insults, injuries, displeasure, pain, suffering. As an example, you could show up with an offensive smell. Okay, you come to the office, you don't wear deodorant, you just come from the gym and you don't take a shower. You're working with guys outside in construction, and you just, you got done eating seafood and onions and, you all in somebody's face while you're trying to, hammer something to put it together. That goes with ethics as well. It's unethical. It's not a matter of morals. It's a matter of ethics. Morals has to do with what is right, wrong, good, or bad. It's not right or wrong, good or bad to not wear deodorant. It's simply offensive to others for you not to. So it's not about the principle of something being right, wrong, good, or bad. It's what is acceptable. What is the acceptable standard? Code of conduct. What is unacceptable behavior? Certain type of clothes that we put on in certain environments. So it always has to do with where you're at why you're there, and who's there. So the who, what, when, where, why comes into play with ethics. The context of ethics changes with the who, the what, the why, and the where. What is acceptable with this person is not acceptable with that person. What is acceptable in such and such environment is not acceptable, in another environment. As an example, with your coworkers, you will have, or colleagues, you'll have certain conversations that you won't have with, say, your manager or, your elders, other figures who you hold in higher regard or esteem. There's certain conversations that you will not have with certain people because it's not ethical to do so. You understand? And so my point here is not to educate anyone about what ethics is, but really to help us to understand how Venus and the moon are the source of morals and ethics, and the reason why. Okay? The reason why is that Venus connects us to relationships, and it also connects us to that which holds value. So the laws and codes of ethics has to go with that, so that when we are dealing with other people or dealing with things that hold value, that there is always justice around the conduct involved in those interactions. Okay? It's about justice being preserved through proper conduct. Okay? Ethics is to have the awareness of what is acceptable or not of proper conduct. The reason being is that morals are not universal. Morals are limited to your own household, your own quote-unquote people, family, and community. My morals does not translate to your morals, nor can I enforce that upon anyone, nor can I expect anyone to have the same morals that I have. However, we can agree upon what is ethical in a particular institution or as a particular code of conduct in whatever interactions of the 7th house, the 8th house, the 10th house, or the 11th house that we have. In fact, all of the houses past the 6th house requires ethics. Okay? The 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th house, these are houses of morals. The 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, even 12th house, which is of the world, those are houses of ethics. Okay? Because the first 6 houses are the self. The last 6 houses from 7th on to the 12th, those are the houses of the outer, of what is outside of the self. Okay? So morals is with the self. It's your moral compass that guides you not to violate justice to yourself or justice to those who you are entrusted with, justice to those who you have close, intimate stance and position with, not to cause injury or offense. Okay? That's important to understand. And so ethics applies to the outer realm, which is the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th house. That's where ethics at. Venus is what connects you to the outer houses. Okay? Venus starts at in outer relationships at the 7th house. Okay? With your realization of values, okay, she hosts the 2nd house, Taurus. That's your own personal realization of values and that which you value.
In that world, with that anthropology, that theory of the human person, we would say that morals are personally chosen by the individual. And there would be no moral universals because it's really every person for themselves. The alternate anthropology, which is most evident these days amongst indigenous people, is that people are social creatures who thrive when practicing common customs. And for them, their ethics tend to come more from their customs and traditions, and the individuals see themselves as becoming more virtuous, whatever, and more valuable, more important. They have more self-respect, not for what they individually own or individually achieve, but rather what contribution they make to their community. It gives you a completely different form of society. If we look at these two different approaches to society, we can come to some immediate conclusions. Firstly, we can see that ethics cannot be a personal choice. It really suggests that there are decisions that one has to make to act outside of one's self-interest, and this takes us back to the API's comment about acting for the client's interest rather than one's own. Ethical reasoning, one way or another, must be about finding and not making morals, because if I simply make my own moral framework up, it's likely to be biased towards my inclination towards self-interest, again violating that expectation of the API, but also the expectation of most people that you would meet in the society. It gives rise to two classes of ethical systems. Systems that are the subject of the human person, in other words, they're made by the human individual, so they're created by the moral actor. I decide on my morals, I decide whether murder or telling lies or what have you is good or bad for me, and there's really no absolute good or bad. Lying just happens to be my social custom. You might come from a different society, that sort of idea. Most of you would have heard that. As opposed to ethical systems that are freestanding, what we call objective. They come from the way the world is, the actual facts and nature of the matter. If it turns out that murdering people and telling lies and what have you is something which can be understood by understanding what is actually out there, a scientific approach, if you like, then it means that appropriate relations between people, those principles for appropriate action, are found and accepted by the moral actor. They're not actually made. Let's look at the history of civilization, trust, and ethics. Civilization is something a little bit different to society. Civilization is that arrangement of human persons where individuals may have a high level of trust in the appropriate action of others. I can have a pretty wild and woolly society which is not very civilized, in which case I probably have to spend a fair bit of my energy taking precautions against the unexpected things, usually unpleasant things, that others might do for me. In a civilized society, I would expect to be able to walk down the street or live my life relatively peacefully, with not having to devote a great deal of energy to self-defense. It's an environment where one has the freedom to flourish, to be the best you can. And when we look through history, we'll see that places where we've had the least civilization are the places where people have had the most miserable lives. Civilization has something to do with being able to make expectations of those around us. It's got to do with trust. Again, this echoes back to the API Code of Ethics. Trust cannot be forced on somebody else. I can't force you to trust or to be a trustworthy person. You can't, in a sense, force trust upon me. It's something that is somehow almost part of the social civilized atmosphere. It comes from confidence in the unexpected goodwill of the other that through habit becomes expected. And having that level of trust, that level of expectation, is really a sign of civilization.
Okay, your values and that which you value. The seventh house, Venus, is the one who initiates your approach with justice in your conduct so that it harmonizes with others. Libra, so that it does not tip the scales with others, Libra, so that there is viscosity, ease, and diplomacy, Libra, with the intent of inclining to good feeling, good faith, good memory, good rapport, intentionally causing good or positive experiences through the five senses between you and others: smell, taste, sound, sight, touch. In every way, we want it to be pleasant, which is why when you are in professional encounters with others, you will notice that all of these checkpoints are usually addressed. You're well groomed, you smell good, you speak in a certain way that carries a positive demeanor, enthusiastic, alert, attentive, sensitivity, kindness, consideration, demonstrating your consideration, opening doors. You wipe off the seat before they sit down. There's many customs that carry and translates ethics. Ethics is also how we get out of the water with what is right and wrong. Okay, because morals has an emotional connection to what you see as right and wrong. And that can have a triggering effect immediately, putting you in the mode of righteous anger. But when it comes to ethics, we stay in the ethereal, the air of that judgment. And in the air of that judgment, we are less attached and less personal in how we respond or react to offenses when it comes to ethics. Ethical violations are usually addressed in a non-personal way, in an ethereal sensitivity, an ethereal disposition. You use intelligent words that are not necessarily direct and harsh or blunt, but they are chosen words, selected words that carry the meaning without pain, without infliction, without offense, without accusation, without demeaning, without criticizing, without judging. Okay? That is where professionalism comes from. That's what it's all about. Knowing how to say things without causing injury. Knowing how to communicate things without breaking, cutting, and destroying. Understand, Venus rules these things. As I mentioned before, you can go to my website, www.the-infamous-astrologist.com, and you could go there and check out some reads, some very good reads about Ma'at, okay? Libra, through Venus, represents Ma'at, okay? You seek Ma'at in every city. She is the source of our awareness of justice, ethics, fair dealings, proper conduct, justice, fair dealings, ethics, proper conduct, professionalism. That is Ma'at, to bring harmony, viscosity, and fair dealing. It's not so simple as to say to bring harmony, but you make the effort to create harmony, to manifest harmony. You harmonize. Harmonizing requires an awareness of the other person's sensitivities and needs, an awareness of other people's value. And it requires compromise, give and take, selflessness, patience, sensitivity, once again. I can't use that word enough in this. A balancing of the scales. Ma'at is part of that judgment of the heart that Anu will judge concerning your heart on one side of the scale and feathers and a feather of truth on the other side of the scale. This comes back again to Libra. Libra is the first court, the first of the three courts. The first court is Libra. The second court is Scorpio. The third court is Sagittarius. We have Mars that is now getting ready to enter into Libra very soon. And when Mars enters into Libra, it goes to court. And what goes to court is your actions, aspects, experiences, behaviors related to that particular planet or impulse. It gets judged. So Mars is to judge your actions. It is to judge your willpower and how you have used it, your assertive nature and what it has made or created, your identity. It's all going to go to the three courts.
Let's look now at the ethical moral systems. We can see that there have been many ethical systems down through history. They really come down to two categories, and we've mentioned those already. It also lines up with two societies. The sociologist Ferdinand Tönnies described these two societies in using German terms, either Gemeinschaft or community-like societies, where you have a strong customary ethic linked to stable objective values, or a Gesellschaft association, society, so a society which is more like a club, where the individual gets their, joins the club, the society, out of what they can get out of it, and on the moral calculus that what they put into it is no more than what they get out. Hopefully they get out a lot more than they put in, that sort of thing. In the same way that we might join a football club or a sports club or something, where we join the club and maybe change our membership depending on which will give us the best value. That's rather different to the the community type association, which tends to be more like a family. You're born into it, and one way or another you have to accept its existence and then define yourself around it. So there's Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft are sociological terms which describe most of the societies which have existed down through history. Other sociologists have used this notion of community versus association as metaphors for society, Gemeinschaft versus Gesellschaft, to look at the fortunes of societies through history. Carl Zimmermann, a sociologist of the 20th century, looked at the history of the great civilizations of the West, and he noticed that the Gemeinschaft type of ethic of society existed in early Greece up until about the time of Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates. Those three thinkers, who tend to be the Greeks who have given us the beginnings of social and moral thought, was changing in their period in history. It was really going from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft. The curious thing about the Greek culture is that while it made that transition at a time when Greece was at its cultural peak, its economic peak, and its political peak, somehow riding on that peak when everything was comfortable and good, the Greeks changed their ethical system to something a bit more subjective and individualistic, and Greece became weaker and eventually faded out of history. And that's shown on this timeline, where the fortunes of Greece are rising in the orange line, and eventually they sort of fade out. They were replaced by the Romans. The Romans, at the time when they were taking over Greece, also had a Gemeinschaft society and objective ethics. By the time you get to around 150 BC, the Roman Gemeinschaft ethic was being superseded by Gesellschaft ethic, and the Stoic writers, including Cicero, are representative of thinkers who were attempting to reclaim the Gemeinschaft values in a Gesellschaft society. And while Rome continued to flourish politically for a time and economically, relatively soon after it started to decline in political and economic terms. The dotted line here represents its moral decline as the Gesellschaft values, the individualism, gave way to many practices in Rome that were really quite antisocial. You had emperors poisoning each other and things like that. The end of Rome saw the beginning of the Dark Ages, which was a period of rather low civilization in Europe that extended from roughly the 5th century up until around the beginning of the 9th century.
The first of the three courts that it goes to is LIBRA, and that is where publicly in the carnal world of institutions, businesses, groups, organizations, okay, any place that is established brick and mortar, okay, that's where your actions through Mars, that's where your identity through Mars is going to be judged. And in particular, what's going to be judged is your ethical behaviors concerning it, rather or not you have violated any ethics, rather or not you were considerate of what justice is supposed to mean, rather or not you honored the laws of Ma'at. That's what's going to be judged. So the judge of Mars is going to be Venus as Mars passes through Libra, the court of Libra, being accountable to the court of Libra. Understand? So when Mars gets to Scorpio, he's at home, but he still has to give account through that court. Giving account through that court, Pluto will also be involved with that judgment. And this is the judgment of your actions as it relates to power struggles, as it relates to how you behaved and reacted through Mars concerning disillusionment. Your willingness to accept things that you can't change and what you've done if you refuse to. It's going to judge your intimate experiences where you may have violated laws of this universe concerning that. 8th house matters, where you have broken trust. Someone was trusting in you and you broke the trust, or where there are secrets that are hidden that does harm, untruths. 8th house matters. Domination over other people's identities. Trauma, pain, deep pain and trauma, deaths, losses. How did you, through your identity, violate laws concerning Scorpio? Scorpio is a court of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, because it's the court that judges according to the instincts, not according to ethical ideals. Okay, so when Mars goes through Libra, it's ethical. When it goes through Scorpio, it's natural. You see, that's different. So the ethical law that Mars is subject to at Libra is going to be the surface appearance of justice, your appearance of justice in your identity or not. your appearance of justice and your actions and what you assert yourself to create or initiate or not. How you tip the scales. But when it comes to Scorpio, that goes back to the instincts, the underworld. This is where people in a personal level get justice for how you may have abused, violated, mistreated, or misused your power, your advantage over others, or held secrets to the detriment of others, things of that nature. Okay? And this is where it's eye for eye, tooth for tooth, where you may find that you end up realizing what you caused somebody else to suffer, because now it comes back on you the exact same way through that court. It also is where people are not necessarily judging your actions or your identity based on what is popularly accepted or commonly accepted through ethical means, but more so through the instincts. And the instinctive nature of judgment is different than the ethereal LIBRA ethical standard of judgment. The standard of judgment in the underworld, Scorpio, it is street justice. That is street justice. So this is where street justice manifests to your ways, actions, and identity. It's where street justice gives the perception in the read on whether or not you was right, wrong, good or bad, fair or unfair, just or unjust, oppressive or protective. Understand? This is going to be what you did in the 8th house. When Mars goes into Libra, it judges what you did in the 7th house. Okay? When it goes into Sagittarius, what you did in the 9th house. Okay? So these things get judged. Understand?
When you get to the beginning of the 9th century, the year 800 AD, you had the event of Charles the Great reunifying the Western Roman Empire in a new empire that was led by Germanic culture. The Germans had been coming into Rome for centuries, being basically invited into the Rome to do things like run their armies. By the time you get to 800, Rome as a political force had long gone, and Charlemagne, as a relatively, well, I won't say small-time king, but a ruler, was able, through his military exploits, to reunify Western Europe. And it's really where we get Western Europe from. From about that time onwards, and pretty much driven by the Germanic ethic of solidarity, we had the progressive civilization of Europe, the re-civilization of Europe, in a period which is known as the Middle Ages. And we have improvements in the political, economic, and cultural life of Europe as a result, and really the formation of what is now known as Europe. That period of cultural growth tended to have a turning point at the beginning of modernity, around the year 1500, especially with people such as Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli reintroduced the idea of subjective ethics. He wrote an important book known as The Prince, or called The Prince, in which he argued that the leader of society should cultivate the power to do wrong in order to achieve his political ends. If you translate that, it simply means that in order to get what you want, in other words, political advancement, you should be willing to do whatever it takes, including deception, fraud, whatever you. And so Machiavelli's Prince, while it's a very famous book, you can download it off the internet and read parts of it. I recommend that you read chapter 14, for instance. It makes for a rather colourful set of moral principles and ethic for princes. And given that Machiavelli is known as the father of modernity, being familiar with Machiavelli and the Prince, let's say chapter 14, doesn't take long to read, you can understand why the moral fibre of Europe began in a very different direction, one which favoured individualism to the point now where we think that individualism is very much the way to go, but it also transformed Europe into a trajectory towards Gesellschaft, cultural organisation, social organisation. Now, Europe, of course, has continued to flourish well past Machiavelli. However, there is a certain question many people are asking today, especially when you look at the condition, the social condition, the law and order issues and so on that are erupting in many parts of the world. And we don't have to look simply to the United States, but we look to Europe and also parts of Australia, where 50 or 60 years ago, all of the capital cities of Australia were safe places for people to be out at night, whereas now our major capital cities are becoming quite dangerous in certain parts. There are indications that something is changing in our society, and unfortunately it's something rather ugly. Is the trajectory of the West similar to that of Rome and Greece? Well, someone like Zimmerman would say there's a certain similarity and point to the way that there is something awkward about Gesellschaft society in terms of its capacity to support civilization. What we can conclude from this brief waltz through history is that people tend to flourish under objective ethics. It's a civilizing influence. Comfortable societies, though, tend to breed subjective ethics. They tend to transform themselves from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft societies at the peak of their material success. And once transformed, subjective ethical systems tend to destroy civilizations. Sociologists who have studied this issue are finding it difficult to find examples of societies once transformed to subjective ethics that have actually survived the test of time.
So my main point is so that we understand that Venus and the moon are very different. Okay? And noticing what responsibility we have. As Venus is passing through Cancer, she's tuning in to the moral conviction that you realized while Juno was retrograde in Scorpio. She's tuning in to the matriarchal constitution that you restored within yourself, the commitment to the moral value, the moral principle in your life that you realized through the Cancer Mars retrograde of a 7 to 9 month period. And she's sourcing it in order to convert it into ethical wisdom by which she does justice to others in interactions based on the authority of the matriarchal law that was realized at Cancer. Okay? So this is what's happening. And what she's doing is she's representing you or representing you. Get it? Representing you, representing you before others, backed by that matriarchal wisdom that you sourced from the Cancer Mars retrograde and also from the Juno retrograde in Scorpio, which is now direct. This is why we need to understand this. And the way that it's going to show up is you appreciating, honoring, being sensitive to the ethical code of conduct that you realize should be there between you and other people. It's you acting like you got home training this time. You acting like somebody raised you. You acting like you got some sense. It's you putting away the ghetto behavior. It's you stop doing nigger shit. You see what I'm saying? It's cleaning up your act. because you having this insight that the source of much of your grievances, your anger, your offenses, it came from you in a way you used to behave, act, or interact. You started to put the pieces together to realize that the trauma, victimization that we walk around want to complain about, most of it came from our own violations of our moral compass and constitution with the inner self. You have trauma, drama, pain, and bad experiences from this person and that person and that person, but most of it came from our straying away from the moral compass of the self, beginning with cancer. And we reflect the moral disposition that we have with ourself or the family that we come from. And we go into the outer world reflecting and projecting that onto others. And if it is not up to par or socially acceptable, if it is not just on the scales, we get a very negative outcome and we want to cry victim. We want to say, oh, they did this and they did that. But really it started with your own energy that you were not aware of. Emotional awareness, emotional intelligence, expanding. That is Cancer Jupiter, the expansion of emotional intelligence. Emotional wisdom, emotional insight. Understand, this is what's happening. Venus has to pass through in order to convert it to an ethical code of conduct that you now realize is the foundation of doing justice with others as interactions. You see what I'm saying? This is the wings of Ma'at that's spreading over the entryway of every city. What is a city? A city is a being. It is your body, it is your temple. It is you as a person. The natural person is a city. And Ma'at spreads her wings over the city, which is this realization of justice through ethics and code of conduct and how we must interact with each other in order to convert or convey a realization of other people's value. Not in comparison to your value, but in honor of their value. As a sign of your own value with yourself, which is the only way that you could have realized that you owe somebody else value. Understand that. So let's make sure we understand this before we go any farther concerning Venus and the moon. Please ask questions if you feel I left something out.